The Silk Roads, A New History of the World, by Peter Frankopan. Introduction. When I was a boy, my parents gave me a large map of the world. It wasn't for school, not really. It was for my bedroom wall, right next to my bed. And every night, I would lie there and just stare at it. I learned the names of countries, their capitals, the vast blue oceans, the rivers that snaked their way across continents. But the parts that really captured my imagination were the names written in italics, the ones that whispered of danger and adventure, the Gobi Desert, the Himalayas, the Hindu Kush. As I got older, I started to feel a strange sense of unease. At school, the story of history we were told felt small. It was a story that started in ancient Greece, moved to Rome, then blossomed in Christian Europe. It gave us the Renaissance, the Enlightenment, and finally, the triumph of the West, with America as its shining star. It was a neat, tidy story. A story of progress. A story where everything important seemed to happen in one small corner of that giant map on my wall. I'd look up at that map and see these immense regions, Central Asia, Persia, China, India, all passed over in silence. It was as if they were just the backdrop, the scenery for the real drama happening in Europe. But what if that story, the one we've all been told, is wrong? What if the history of the world isn't a straight line leading to us, here in the West? What if, for most of human history, the world didn't pivot around Rome or London, but around cities whose names we can barely pronounce, like Samarkand, Bukhara, or Merv? That is the profound, world-altering question at the heart of the book we're exploring today. The Silk Roads, A New History of the World by the brilliant Oxford historian, Peter Frankopan. This isn't just another history book. It's a reorientation of everything you thought you knew. It takes that map on the wall and turns it on its head, showing us that for millennia, the true center of the world, its vibrant, beating heart, wasn't in the West at all. It was in the network of roads, rivers, and pathways that connected the East and West. The Silk Roads. By the end of our journey today, I promise you this, you will never look at a map of the world the same way again. You will see that the story of humanity is not about the rise of the West, but about the connections that have bound us all together, a story of exchange, of conflict, and of a global center of gravity that is, even now, shifting back to where it has always belonged. Let's begin. Book summary. Our story doesn't start in Athens or Rome. It starts in the cradle of civilization itself, the fertile lands of Mesopotamia and Persia. This was the heart of the world, long before Europe was anything more than a cold, sparsely populated backwater. The Persian Empire, founded thousands of years ago, was a marvel of the ancient world. It was a superpower that stretched from the shores of Greece all the way to the Himalayas. And it was built on a simple, powerful idea: openness. The Persians were masters of adopting foreign customs. If a defeated enemy had better clothing, they'd wear it. If they had better ideas, they'd use them. They built an astonishing network of roads, with messages traveling over 1,600 miles in a single week, a feat that seemed like magic to the ancient Greeks. This was an empire of plenty, a beacon of stability that connected the Mediterranean to the very heart of Asia. Its cities, like Babylon and Persepolis, were legendary, adorned with gold from Afghanistan, cedar from Lebanon, and ivory from India. To the Greeks, the East was everything. It was where culture, wealth, and opportunity came from. It was also where the threats came from. So when a young, ambitious general from Macedon named Alexander came to power, he never once looked west. Europe offered nothing. No great cities, no culture, no glory. His eyes, like everyone else's, were fixed on the East, on the grand prize, Persia. Alexander's conquest of the Persian Empire in the 4th century BC is often seen as a brilliant but fleeting military campaign. But what he truly did was open a superhighway for ideas. He didn't just conquer, he connected. The Greek world collided with the Persian world, and something new was born. Greek language, art, and philosophy flooded eastwards. You could find Greek inscriptions carved into stone as far away as modern-day Afghanistan, with maxims from Delphi teaching children to be well-behaved and elders to be wise. But this was no one-way street. Ideas flowed back just as powerfully. The collision was astonishing. Statues of the Buddha only started to appear after the Greek god Apollo became known in India. In fact, the earliest statues of the Buddha look remarkably like Apollo. Buddhists felt they had to compete with this new, visually powerful religion, so they borrowed from it. Great literary epics, like India's are, may have been influenced by Homer's Iliad and Odyssey. Stories, ideas, and faiths were traveling along these pathways, carried by merchants, soldiers, and pilgrims. Alexander didn't just build an empire, he accelerated the connection of the world's central nervous system. And that system was about to get much, much bigger. On the other side of Asia, another giant was stirring. The Han dynasty in China was expanding its horizons, pushing its frontiers westward. The Chinese were driven by an almost insatiable demand for one thing: horses. Specifically, the magnificent heavenly horses bred in the Fergana Valley, on the other side of the Pamir Mountains. These powerful steeds were said to sweat blood and were the key to China's military might, essential for defending against the nomadic tribes of the steppes, like the fearsome Xiongnu. To get these horses, and to secure peace, the Chinese began a formal system of tribute. They gave luxury gifts, including rice, wine, and textiles. But the most important item was silk. This light, beautiful fabric was treasured by the nomads. It was also a symbol of power. To be wrapped in silk was to be important. In 1 year alone, the Chinese gave the Xiongnu 30,000 rolls of silk. This exchange was the beginning. China was opening a door to a transcontinental network. And as it did, it found something remarkable. Bamboo and cloth made in the heart of China were for sale thousands of miles away in the markets of Bactria, in modern Afghanistan. The world was already connected. It just needed a name. The German geologist Ferdinand von Richthofen would give it 1 century later: the Silk Roads. These routes were not just for silk, and they weren't just roads. They were a sprawling network of arteries, fanning out in every direction, carrying not just goods, but ideas, religions, technologies, and even diseases. They were the world's central nervous system, lying just beneath the skin, invisible to the naked eye. And for millennia, the pulse of the world beat along these pathways. Now, let's fast forward a few hundred years. As China opened up to the west, a small town on the Italian peninsula was slowly, methodically, building an empire of its own: Rome. But Rome's transformation from a regional power to a global superpower wasn't about conquering Europe. Europe was poor, undeveloped. The real prize, the engine of Rome's spectacular rise, was the East. The pivotal moment was the seizure of Egypt in 30 BC. The fabulous wealth of Egypt, built on the grain harvests of the Nile, flooded into Rome. Grain prices plummeted. Interest rates crashed. There was a surge in property prices. Disposable income shot up so dramatically that the Emperor Augustus could boast that he found Rome a city of brick and left it a city of marble. This surging wealth was built on the ruthless expropriation of the East. And it created a hunger. A hunger for luxury, for the exotic, for everything the East had to offer. Soon, 120 Roman ships were sailing for India every year. The ports of India weren't just selling their own goods, they were emporiums for treasures from all over Southeast Asia and even as far as Vietnam. Roman coins have been found all across India, in such quantities that local rulers may have melted them down to make their own currency. The tastes of Rome's newly rich became legendary. Pheasants from the Black Sea, guinea fowl from Africa, rare fish. And, of course, silk from China. Conservative Romans were horrified. The philosopher Seneca declared that silk garments could barely be called clothing, as they hid neither the curves nor the decency of Roman ladies. They were a symbol of exoticism and eroticism. But the demand was unstoppable. Pliny the Elder complained that 100 million sesterces a year were being pumped out of the Roman economy to pay for these luxuries, an astonishing sum, representing nearly half the empire's annual mint output. This flow of money didn't just enrich Rome. It transformed the cities along the trade routes. Places like Palmyra in the Syrian desert, the Venice of the sands, and Petra in Jordan became wonders of the ancient world, their spectacular architecture funded by the constant flow of commerce. This interconnected world was vibrant, competitive, and complex. A gold coin struck in Britain could pay a soldier, be collected as tax, pass into the hands of a merchant heading east, pay for spices in India, and end up in the Hindu Kush, where a local ruler might admire its design and have it copied. The world, 2,000 years ago, was globalized. And as goods and money flowed along these arteries, so did something else, something far more powerful: ideas about the divine. The Silk Roads were not just pathways for merchants, they were roads of faith. And in the crowded spiritual marketplace of the ancient world, religions competed for hearts and minds with the same intensity as traders competed for profits. Buddhism, born in India, was one of the first great success stories of this new, connected world. It spread rapidly across Asia, championed by rulers like the Emperor Ashoka. Its concepts traveled west too. A religious sect in Alexandria, Egypt, known as the Therapeutae, bore an uncanny resemblance to Buddhism, focusing on enlightenment through prayer and detachment from the self. Was this a coincidence, or a sign of how far these ideas could travel? As Buddhism expanded, it evolved. Originally, it was an intensely personal, spiritual journey. But as it came into contact with other faiths, it had to compete. Statues of the Buddha began to appear, modeled on the Greek god Apollo. Shrines and stupas were built, becoming points of pilgrimage. Music and offerings became part of worship. Giving donations, gold, silver, lapis lazuli, diamonds, became a way to achieve salvation. Monasteries sprang up along the trade routes, becoming centers of scholarship where texts were copied and translated into local languages. The faith was becoming more visible, more accessible, and more compelling. Christianity, too, was an Eastern religion. Born in Jerusalem, its stories were shaped by the deserts of the Near East, its language was Aramaic, and its theological backdrop was Judaism. And like Buddhism, it spread along the trade routes. Its progress was far more spectacular in the East than in the Mediterranean. Christian communities dotted the Persian Gulf and stretched as far as modern-day Afghanistan by the early 3rd century. This spread of new faiths created tension. In Persia, the rise of the powerful Sasanian dynasty brought a resurgence of an ancient faith, Zoroastrianism. This religion, with its concept of a cosmic struggle between good and evil, light and darkness, provided a powerful moral framework for a resurgent empire. Fire temples were built, and a distinct Persian identity was asserted. And with it came persecution. Jews, Buddhists, and especially Christians were targeted. The promotion of one faith often meant the suppression of another. The real turning point, the moment that would change the world, came in the early 4th century with the conversion of the Roman Emperor, Constantine. When the most powerful man in the Western world embraced Christianity, it was a seismic event. But it had an unintended and disastrous consequence for Christians in the East. Constantine began to portray himself not just as the ruler of Rome, but as the protector of Christians everywhere, including in the rival Persian Empire. To the Persian Shah, this sounded like a threat. Christians inside his empire were now seen as a fifth column, a potential advance guard for a Roman invasion. Constantine's embrace of Christianity, which laid the foundation for a Christian Europe, simultaneously compromised the future of Christianity in Asia. A brutal wave of persecution was unleashed in Persia. What should have been a moment of unity for the Christian faith instead created a deep and lasting rift. Yet, despite the persecution, Christianity in the East survived. In fact, it thrived. While the Church in the West became embroiled in bitter, complex debates about the precise nature of Jesus, disputes that were as much about politics and power as they were about theology, the Church of the East embarked on one of the most ambitious missionary programs in history. Without the backing of a powerful empire, Christianity spread along the trade routes with astonishing speed. By the middle of the 6th century, there were archbishoprics deep in Asia. Cities like Merv, Samarkand, and even Kashgar on the edge of China had archbishops long before Canterbury did. There were thriving Christian communities across Central Asia 1,000 years before Christianity was brought to the Americas. In the Middle Ages, there were far more Christians in Asia than there were in Europe. We have forgotten this. We have forgotten that for a huge part of its history, Christianity's center of gravity was in the East. Its success was partly due to its adaptability. Missionaries in China explained the Holy Spirit in terms that Buddhists could understand, suggesting that Christianity wasn't a rival faith, but was, in a broad sense, a form of Buddhism. This fusion of ideas made the religion feel familiar and accessible. But at the very moment Christianity seemed poised for a spiritual conquest of Asia, a new revelation, a new voice, emerged from the deserts of Arabia. And it would change the world forever. The rise of Islam didn't happen in a vacuum. It took place in a world exhausted by centuries of conflict between the two great superpowers of the age, Rome and Persia. A devastating plague in the 6th century, likely the first appearance of bubonic plague, had swept along the trade routes, ravaging cities from Egypt to China and causing a severe economic depression. As Rome and Persia weakened, a trader from Mecca named Muhammad began to receive a series of revelations from God. The message was powerful and simple: there is one God, and Muhammad is his messenger. It was a message of unity, preached in Arabic, for the Arab peoples. It drew on familiar traditions, venerating the prophets of Judaism and Christianity, like Abraham and Moses. It taught that believers who followed the Jewish or Christian faiths, the people of the book, had nothing to fear. This message of conciliation and unity was vital to Islam's early success. Muhammad and his followers went to great lengths to win the support of Jewish and Christian communities. Many Jews in Palestine and Arabia welcomed the Arabs as liberators from oppressive Roman rule. Some even speculated that Muhammad was proclaiming the advent of the Messiah. Similarly, many nonconformist Christian groups, who had been persecuted by the Orthodox Church in Constantinople, saw the Muslims as allies. The new rulers often showed honor to Christian priests and monasteries and even endowed them with gifts. This tolerance, combined with strategic genius and the promise of both spiritual and material rewards, fueled an explosive expansion. The system was brilliant. Booty seized from non-believers was shared among the faithful, with those who converted early receiving a larger share. It was a highly efficient motor for conquest. As Persia imploded from internal conflict and Rome was too weak to respond, the armies of Islam swept out of Arabia. They didn't just conquer, they united the economic heartlands of the ancient world. The rich agricultural lands of Egypt and Mesopotamia were now linked, forming the core of a new political and economic behemoth that stretched from the Himalayas to the Atlantic. The Islamic conquest created a new world order. The center of gravity, which for a brief period had been pulled towards Constantinople, now snapped back decisively to the east. A new capital was founded that would become the richest and most populous city in the world for centuries: Baghdad. Baghdad was the perfect symbol of the Islamic world's affluence. It was the heart of royal power, patronage, and prestige. It marked a new center of gravity, the political and economic axis linking lands in every direction. The wealth that flowed into the city was staggering. The Caliph H.R. N. al-Rashid's treasury included thousands of turbans, porcelain vessels, jewels, and vast quantities of gold and silver. This wealth fueled an incredible period of prosperity and an intellectual revolution. Brilliant scholars, many of them not Muslim, were drawn to the court at Baghdad and to other centers of excellence like Bukhara and Samarkand. A massive translation movement began, rendering texts from Greek, Persian, and Sanskrit into Arabic. The works of Aristotle, Ptolemy, and Euclid were devoured and built upon. This was a golden age. While much of Christian Europe withered in gloom, crippled by poverty and a disdain for scientific inquiry, the Islamic world was ablaze with innovation. Scholars like Al-B.R.N. established that the world revolves around the sun. Polymaths like Ibn S.N., known in the West as Avicenna, wrote groundbreaking works on medicine, philosophy, and mathematics. It was here that algebra was developed, driven in part by the practical need for astronomers to know in which direction Mecca lay for prayers. Paper, a technology that had come from China, became widely available, fueling an explosion of literature, science, and philosophy. This flourishing civilization was a magnet. Its wealth and sophistication drew in people from all over the world, especially from the underdeveloped northern fringes. And just as the riches of Rome had once created a demand for exotic goods, the riches of Baghdad created a demand for something the north had in abundance. From the dark forests and cold rivers of Scandinavia, a new people emerged, drawn south by the lure of unimaginable wealth. We know them as the Vikings. But in the east, they were known as the Rus. These were not the horned helmeted barbarians of popular imagination. They were tough, savvy traders, and ruthless warriors. And they didn't head west to England or France for fame and fortune. They headed east and south, down the great river systems of Russia, toward the Caspian and Black Seas, towards the glittering markets of the Islamic world. They were creating a new Silk Road, the Road of Furs. The demand for animal pelts, sable, ermine, mink, and fox, in the wealthy cities of the Caliphate was immense. Furs were a symbol of status and a practical necessity for warmth. This trade was so lucrative that it transformed the economy of Northern Europe. Astonishingly rich finds of Islamic silver coins, dirhams, have been found all along the rivers of Russia and across Scandinavia. We're not talking about a few coins here and there. We're talking about tens, perhaps hundreds of millions of coins. In modern terms, it was a multi-billion-dollar industry. But the most important commodity they traded, the one that truly paid for the silks and spices they brought back north, was far darker. They traded in human beings. The Rus were ruthless slavers, capturing local Slavic populations and transporting them south. So many were taken captive that their name became the very root of the word for slave in English and many other European languages. Beautiful women were especially prized. The trade was rampant, not just in the East, but across Europe. Prague became a major slave market, attracting Rus and Muslim merchants. Even Venice, the jewel of the Adriatic, built its early wealth on the lucrative and brutal business of human trafficking. For centuries, The economic engine of Europe was fueled by selling its own people into captivity to feed the insatiable demand of the richer, more sophisticated Islamic world. The wealth of the East was the magnet that pulled Europe out of the Dark Ages. This constant flow of trade and people created new centers of power. The Khazars, a Turkic tribe that controlled the steppes north of the Black and Caspian Seas, became a major force. They were the gatekeepers, controlling the flow of goods and people between the north and the south. So powerful did they become that the Byzantine emperor in Constantinople sought a marriage alliance with them, an almost unprecedented move. The Khazars grew rich from taxes and trade, and their capital, Atil, became a bustling, cosmopolitan city with separate courts for Muslims, Christians, and pagans. And in a move that baffled and fascinated the world, the Khazar elite converted to Judaism in the 9th century. They were positioning themselves as a neutral third party between the Christian and Islamic worlds. But the Rus were not content to be mere traders. They began to muscle in on the Khazars' territory, picking off their tributary tribes one by one, and redirecting the flow of tribute to themselves. Eventually, they attacked and destroyed Atil, effectively removing the Khazars from the equation. The Rus were now the masters of the Western steppe. They had founded a new state, one that would become Russia, built on the profits of trade with the East. Their focus, however, was about to shift. The Caliphate in Baghdad was beginning to fracture. Internal divisions and economic pressures were taking their toll. As the markets in the Muslim world became less stable, the Rus turned their gaze towards another great city, one fabled in their folklore as Miklagarthri, the great city, Constantinople. This shift marked the beginning of a profound reorientation. The wealth and power that had been concentrated in Baghdad for centuries were now beginning to diffuse. The Byzantine Empire was experiencing a golden age, its coffers filled by trade and its armies resurgent. And in the West, something was stirring. The Crusades. We often think of the Crusades as a purely religious war, a battle for the Holy Land. But that's only half the story. As Peter Frankopan shows us, it was also Europe's first major, violent attempt to connect directly with the wealth and power of the East. By the end of the 11th century, Europe was changing. Its population was growing, its economy was developing, and a new, aggressive knightly class had emerged. When the Byzantine Emperor Alexios I sent an appeal for help against the Seljuk Turks who were threatening his eastern frontier, Pope Urban II saw an opportunity. He called for a great expedition to march east, not just to help their Christian brethren, but to liberate the holy city of Jerusalem. The response was overwhelming. Tens of thousands set off on a perilous journey that became a road to heaven itself. The Pope promised that those who took the cross would receive absolution for their sins. Those who fell in battle would be considered martyrs. But alongside piety was greed. The leaders of the crusade, men like the ambitious Norman Bohemond, quickly realized that there were immense opportunities for wealth and power in the East. After capturing the great city of Antioch, Bohemond refused to hand it over to the Byzantine emperor as he had sworn to do. He carved out a principality for himself. He had come to the East to stay. The real winners of the First Crusade, however, were not the knights who settled in the Holy Land. They were the maritime city-states of Italy, Venice, Genoa, and Pisa. They were quick to see the commercial possibilities. The fledgling Crusader states were precariously placed, in desperate need of supplies, reinforcements, and naval support to capture the coastal cities. The Italian fleets were in a powerful negotiating position. In return for their help, they were granted staggering concessions. In every city captured by the Crusaders, they were promised a church, a market square, a third of all plunder, and complete immunity from all taxes. These agreements were the foundation for fortunes that transformed these cities from regional centers into international powers. an intense rivalry kicked off between them, a great game for control of the lucrative trade routes of the eastern Mediterranean. For the next 2 centuries, Europe poured enormous effort and resources into holding on to these new colonies. But the Crusader states were an island in a hostile sea. And in the late 12th century, a brilliant leader emerged who would unite the Muslim world, al-Din, or Saladin. In 1187, at the Battle of Hattin, he annihilated the army of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. Soon after, the Holy City surrendered. The fall of Jerusalem was a humiliating blow to the Christian world. But it also revealed a fundamental truth. For all the religious rhetoric, the real prize was not just Jerusalem, it was access to the trade routes of the East. And as the Crusader presence in the Holy Land dwindled, the Italian city-states simply adapted. They established new colonies on the Black Sea, which became a new gateway for goods coming from the East. Their true breakthrough, however, came from an unexpected quarter: the Mongols. The rise of the Mongols in the 13th century was one of the most terrifying events in history. From the steppes of Mongolia, a leader named Temujin, better known as Genghis Khan, united the nomadic tribes and unleashed a wave of conquest that created the largest land empire the world has ever seen. The Mongol invasions were brutal. Cities that resisted were razed to the ground, their populations massacred. Stories of their savagery spread terror across Asia and Europe. At Nishapur, every living being, men, women, children, even cats and dogs, was slaughtered, their corpses piled into enormous pyramids as a gruesome warning. When the Mongols swept into Russia and then into Poland and Hungary, it seemed to Europe that the apocalypse had arrived. These were not the men of the mythical Christian king, Prester John, coming to save them. These were the Tatars, from the abyss of Tartarus itself. But the Mongols were not just destroyers. They were connectors. Genghis Khan and his successors were masters of organization and administration. They established a vast, secure zone of trade and communication that stretched from the Pacific to the Black Sea. This was the Pax Mongolica, the Mongol Peace. And it made the Silk Roads safer than they had ever been. Ironically, the Mongol conquest made it easier for Europeans to travel east. Missionaries and merchants, like the famous Marco Polo, could now journey all the way to China and back with a degree of security that would have been unimaginable before. They brought back tales of legendary wealth, of palaces with golden roofs, of spices and silks and precious stones. These stories fueled Europe's desire for the goods of the East. And they revealed a world that was far more sophisticated and advanced than Europe. The stability the Mongols provided transformed the economies of Europe. The Italian city-states, especially Venice and Genoa, grew fantastically wealthy by plugging into this new, Mongol-dominated global network. But this interconnectedness had a dark side. The Silk Roads didn't just carry silk and spices, they carried disease. In the mid-14th century, a mysterious illness that brought sudden death began to sweep through the Mongol lands by the Black Sea. It was the bubonic plague. When the Mongols were besieging the Genoese trading post of Kaffa, they began catapulting the corpses of their dead soldiers over the city walls. It was one of the first acts of biological warfare in history. Fleeing Genoese ships carried the disease back to Europe. The Black Death had arrived. It spread like wildfire along the trade routes, killing at least a third, and perhaps as much as half, of the population of Europe. It was a cataclysm, a horror on an unimaginable scale. It seemed to many to signal the end of the world. And yet, paradoxically, the plague turned out to be the catalyst for Europe's making. The chronic depopulation led to a massive labor shortage. Wages for peasants and workers shot up. Rents fell. The old feudal structures began to crumble. Wealth was more evenly distributed. This created a surge in demand for consumer goods. It triggered what historians call an industrious revolution. People worked harder, productivity rose, and new markets emerged. And this change was most rapid in northwestern Europe, in England and the Low Countries. These regions, which had been on the periphery of the more developed South, now began to boom. The social and economic transformations triggered by the Black Death laid the foundations for the long-term rise of the West. But Europe still had a problem. The old Silk Roads, the traditional routes to the riches of Asia, were still controlled by powerful rivals, Venice and, more importantly, the rising Ottoman Empire, which had captured Constantinople in 1453. To get to the spices and silks of the East, you had to go through them and pay their prices. For the kingdoms on the Atlantic seaboard, like Spain and Portugal, this was intolerable. They were at the wrong end of Europe, far from the action. They began to wonder, was there another way? Could they bypass the old routes altogether? This question would lead to two of the most important voyages in human history. In 1492, a Genoese sailor named Christopher Columbus, convinced that he could reach the East by sailing west, set off across the Atlantic with 3 small ships. He was looking for the Great Khan of China. He was looking for gold and spices to fund a new crusade to liberate Jerusalem. He found, of course, something else entirely. 5 years later, a Portuguese navigator named Vasco da Gama successfully rounded the southern tip of Africa and reached India. He had found a direct sea route to the spices of the East. These 2 voyages changed the world forever. Suddenly, Europe was no longer the terminus of the Silk Roads. It was at the center of a new global network. The Americas were connected to Europe and Africa for the first time. New sea lanes connected Europe directly to Asia. The discovery of the Americas unleashed a flood of treasure. The gold and silver of the Aztecs and the Incas, civilizations that were ruthlessly conquered and destroyed by Spanish conquistadors, were shipped back to Europe in unimaginable quantities. The mine at Potosi in modern-day Bolivia was the single largest silver strike in history, accounting for more than half of global production for over a century. This torrent of wealth transformed Europe. It funded a cultural explosion, the Renaissance. But it also funded centuries of near-incessant warfare. The competition between European states, which had always been fierce, now intensified. This relentless conflict spurred incredible advances in military and naval technology. Europe's distinctive character, more aggressive, more violent, more competitive than other parts of the world, now paid off. It was this capacity for organized violence that allowed a small continent on the edge of Eurasia not just to explore the world, but to dominate it. The silver from the Americas didn't just stay in Europe. It became the lubricant for a new global trade. It flowed eastwards to pay for the silks, porcelain, and spices that Europe still craved. Most of it ended up in one place, China. China's vast, sophisticated economy was the engine of global demand, and it had a particular thirst for silver. A silver road now wrapped around the world like a belt, linking the mines of the Andes to the markets of Manila and Guangzhou. For a while, Spain and Portugal were the dominant powers. But the center of gravity in Europe was shifting again, moving north. England and the Netherlands, with their more efficient financial systems, their culture of innovation, and above all, their superior shipbuilding technology, began to challenge the Iberian powers. The Dutch were particularly brilliant. In 1602, they created a single entity to conduct trade with Asia, pooling their resources and sharing the risks. The Dutch East India Company, or VOC, was a forerunner of the modern multinational corporation. And it was ruthless. It didn't just want to trade, it wanted to control. It used military force to drive the Portuguese out of the Spice Islands and establish a monopoly. Amsterdam became the new center of global commerce, and the Netherlands experienced its own golden age, producing breathtaking art by painters like Rembrandt and Vermeer. England followed suit, founding its own East India Company. It was a slow, frustrating process at first. But through a combination of naval power, commercial acumen, and ruthless opportunism, the British began to carve out their own empire in Asia. The pivotal moment came in the mid-18th century with the conquest of Bengal, one of the richest regions of India. The wealth that flowed back to Britain was staggering. Men like Robert Clive became fabulously rich nabobs. The East India Company became a state within a state, an imperial power in all but name. But its rapacious greed led to disaster. A catastrophic famine in Bengal, caused by the company's ruthless policies, killed millions. And the company itself, bloated with corruption, was pushed to the brink of bankruptcy. To bail it out, the British government decided to raise taxes on its colonies in North America. The response was furious. In 1773, a group of colonists dressed as Native Americans boarded ships in Boston Harbor and tipped chests of tea into the water. The Boston Tea Party was a protest against a bailout for a multinational corporation that had run amok on the other side of the world. The American War of Independence was, in a strange way, a consequence of the struggle for control of the Silk Roads. The loss of its American colonies was a humiliating blow for Britain. But it also sharpened its focus on the real prize, India. And it was here that Britain would face its greatest rival in a new great game for control of Asia. That rival was Russia. Throughout the 19th century, Russia expanded relentlessly southwards and eastwards, absorbing the ancient khanates of Central Asia and pushing its frontiers ever closer to the borders of British India. To the British, this was a terrifying prospect. The jewel in the crown of their empire seemed vulnerable. A century-long chess match began, a tournament of shadows played out by spies, soldiers, and diplomats in the mountains and deserts of Persia and Afghanistan. This rivalry, this obsession with protecting the routes to India, became the driving force of British foreign policy. And it was this fear that ultimately led Britain to form an unlikely alliance with its old rival, France, and then, even more astonishingly, with Russia itself. The Triple Entente of 1907 was not primarily about containing Germany. It was about Britain trying to manage its imperial anxieties and protect its position in Asia. But this alliance, designed to bring stability, did the opposite. It created a rigid system of blocks that made Europe a tinderbox. Germany, feeling encircled by France and Russia, developed a siege mentality. The assassination of an Austrian archduke in Sarajevo in 1914 was the spark that lit the flame. But the fuel for the fire had been gathering for decades in the heart of Asia. The First World War was not just a European conflict. It was a war for the world, a war for empire, a war for control of the Silk Roads. And it was a war that would bring the age of European dominance to a bloody and catastrophic end. As the empires of Europe tore each other apart, a new resource was becoming critically important, a resource that would define the 20th century and beyond: oil. And the greatest deposits of this black gold lay in one place: the heart of the old Persian Empire. The discovery of oil in Iran in 1908 by a determined British adventurer named William Knox D'Arcy was one of the most important moments of the modern era. The British government, led by a young, ambitious First Lord of the Admiralty named Winston Churchill, quickly realized that oil was the future of naval warfare. Control of Persian oil, he argued, meant mastery of the seas. In 1914, just weeks before the war began, the British government secretly bought a majority stake in the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, which would later become BP. The Allied cause, Churchill would later say, had floated to victory upon a wave of oil. After the war, Britain and France carved up the remnants of the Ottoman Empire, creating new countries like Iraq and drawing lines in the sand that paid little attention to local history or culture, but paid very close attention to the location of oil fields. This was the age of the pipeline, the new arteries of the modern Silk Road. But this new age of empire was built on shaky foundations. Across the region, a tide of nationalism was rising. People were no longer willing to see their resources exploited by foreign powers. In Iran, a charismatic politician named Mohammad Mossadegh galvanized the country with a simple, powerful demand: the nationalization of Iran's oil. To the British, this was a disaster. It threatened to destroy the last vestiges of their empire and their solvency. When diplomacy failed, they turned to a new, rising power for help. In 1953, the CIA, with British support, orchestrated a coup that overthrew the democratically elected Mossadegh and reinstated the Shah. It was a pivotal moment. The United States had stepped into Britain's shoes. It was now the dominant power in the Middle East, the new guardian of the Silk Roads. It was the beginning of the American Silk Road. The decades that followed were a new great game, a Cold War struggle for influence between the United States and the Soviet Union. The battleground was the Northern Tier, the belt of countries running along the USSR's southern flank: Turkey, Iran, Iraq, and Pakistan. Washington propped up undemocratic regimes, turning a blind eye to corruption and brutality, as long as they were anti-communist. The Shah of Iran, a vain man who believed his reign was a miracle, became one of America's staunchest allies, his regime kept in power by the fearsome secret police, the Savak. This policy of supporting strong men created a festering resentment. The wealth from the oil boom of the 1970s flowed into the pockets of a tiny elite, while the majority of the population saw little benefit. In Iran, this discontent found a voice in an exiled cleric, Ayatollah Khomeini. His message was simple: the West, and America in particular, was the great Satan, the source of all of Iran's problems. In 1979, the dam broke. The Iranian Revolution swept away the Shah and brought Khomeini to power. The American embassy in Tehran was stormed, its diplomats taken hostage. It was a humiliating blow for the United States. Its key ally in the region, its island of stability, was gone. The turmoil spread. The Soviet Union, seeing an opportunity in the chaos, invaded Afghanistan to prop up a floundering communist regime. Washington, spooked by the fall of Iran and the Soviet advance, began to support the Afghan resistance fighters, the Mujahideen. It was a policy of pragmatism, of supporting anyone who would fight the Soviets. They funneled money and weapons, including advanced Stinger missiles, to a motley collection of religious fanatics, tribal leaders, and opportunists. Men like Jalaluddin Haqqani and a young, wealthy Saudi named Osama bin Laden became assets of the CIA. At the same time, the United States was playing a double game. The Iran-Iraq War, which began in 1980, presented another opportunity. Washington supported Saddam Hussein's Iraq, seeing it as a bulwark against revolutionary Iran. It provided intelligence, credit, and dual-use technology, and turned a blind eye when Saddam used chemical weapons against Iranian troops and his own people. But behind the scenes, in a scandal that would become known as Iran-Contra, the Reagan administration was secretly selling arms to Iran, hoping to secure the release of American hostages in Lebanon. When the Soviet Union finally withdrew from Afghanistan in 1989, defeated and demoralized, it looked like a great victory for the United States. When the Berlin Wall fell later that year, and the Soviet Union itself collapsed 2 years after that, it seemed that the West had won the Cold War. It was, some declared, the end of history. A new world order, led by the one preeminent power, the United States, was at hand. But the seeds of future conflict had already been sown. The men who had been armed and trained by the CIA in Afghanistan did not simply lay down their weapons. The anti-Western, anti-American sentiment that had been fueled by decades of intervention and double-dealing had not disappeared. And the brutal dictator in Iraq, who had been built up and supported by the West, was not a stable ally. When Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait in 1990, he crossed a line. Access to Persian Gulf oil, President George H. W. Bush declared, was vital to U.S. national security. A massive coalition force was assembled, and Iraq's army was defeated in a matter of weeks. But Saddam was left in power. The decade that followed was one of simmering tension. And then, on a clear September morning in 2001, the world changed again. The attacks on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon were orchestrated by Osama bin Laden and al-Qaeda, from their safe haven in Afghanistan, under the protection of the Taliban. The response was swift. The United States invaded Afghanistan, toppled the Taliban, and began a manhunt for bin Laden. But the war on terror quickly expanded. The focus shifted to Iraq. Despite a lack of evidence linking Saddam Hussein to 9/11 or proving he possessed weapons of mass destruction, the Bush administration was determined to remove him from power. The invasion of Iraq in 2003 was meant to be a short, sharp war that would bring democracy to the Middle East and secure America's position in the heart of the world. It became a catastrophic, decade-long insurgency that destabilized the entire region and cost trillions of dollars. The story of the last few decades, as Frankopan sees it, is one of a doomed struggle by the West to retain its dominance over the vital territories that link East and West. It has been a story of miscalculation, of short-sightedness, and of a profound lack of understanding of the deep historical forces at play. Because while the West has been focused on fighting fires in Iraq and Afghanistan, the Silk Roads have been quietly re-emerging. A new network is being built, not of caravans and camels, but of pipelines, railways, and fiber-optic cables. The countries of Central Asia, once dismissed as a backwater, are groaning with natural resources: oil, gas, gold, uranium, and the rare earth minerals that are vital for our technology. Their cities are booming, with gleaming new airports and luxury hotels. And a new superpower is rising to connect them all: China. President Xi Jinping has announced a vision for a new Silk Road economic belt, a colossal infrastructure project to link China to Europe through Central Asia. It is investing trillions of dollars in railways that will carry laptops and car parts from China to Germany in 16 days, in pipelines that will bring gas from Turkmenistan to feed its growing economy, and in ports and highways across Asia and Africa. The world's center of gravity is shifting again, back to where it lay for millennia. We in the West have become accustomed to seeing our story as the story. But we are realizing that we are just one part of a much larger, much older narrative. The Silk Roads are rising again. The birthing pains of this new world are all around us, in the turmoil in Ukraine, the tragedy in Syria, the tensions with Iran. The future of the world, Peter Frankopan tells us, will be decided along these ancient pathways. Commentary. When you finish a book like The Silk Roads, the feeling is one of both humility and excitement. Humility, because it forces you to recognize how narrow our typical view of history is. The story we've learned? The one that runs like a neat relay race from Greece to Rome to Europe to America, is not the whole story. It's not even the main story. For most of human history, the action was somewhere else entirely. Peter Frankopan's great achievement is to give us a new map. Not just a geographical map, but a historical one. He shows us that the world has always been interconnected, and that the engine of that connection has, for most of time, been the exchange of goods, ideas, and cultures along the great spine of Asia. Reading this book, you start to see the world differently. You see the Crusades not just as a holy war, but as an economic one. You see the discovery of the Americas not as a beginning, but as a consequence, a desperate attempt by Europe to break into a global system that it did not control. You see the two world wars not as purely European conflicts, but as the death throes of European empires fighting over the control of global resources. And that brings us to the most powerful lesson of this book, especially for someone your age, who is about to step into a world that is changing faster than ever before. History is not just about the past. It is about the future. The reemergence of the Silk Roads is not a historical curiosity. It is the single most important geopolitical and economic story of the 21st century. The competition for resources in Central Asia, the rise of China, the shifting alliances in the Middle East, these are not separate events. They are all part of the same grand narrative, the return of the world's center of gravity to the East. So, what can you do with this knowledge? First, change your perspective. When you look at a map, don't just see countries. See connections. See the ancient routes and the new pipelines and railways being built along them. When you read the news about a conflict in Ukraine, or a trade deal between China and Iran, think about the deeper historical currents that are at play. You will begin to see patterns that others miss. Second, be curious. The story Frankopan tells is a reminder that there are vast and fascinating worlds that we in the West have ignored for too long. Learn about the history of Persia, the cultures of Central Asia, the philosophies of the East. In a world where these regions are becoming more powerful, understanding them is not just an academic exercise, it's a vital skill. And finally, be humble. The rise of the West was a relatively brief, and often brutal, chapter in a much longer story. As the world rebalances, we need to let go of the idea that our way is the only way. We need to be open to learning from others, just as the ancient Persians were. That was a summary of the Silk Roads by Peter Frankopan. We've covered a vast sweep of history today, but I'll be honest with you, a summary can only ever be a signpost. The real journey happens when you read the book yourself. It's in the details, the surprising connections, and the sheer intellectual thrill of seeing the world in a new light. This podcast is a map, but the book is the territory. If anything we've talked about today has sparked your curiosity, I urge you to pick up a copy. Reading it isn't just about learning history, it's about understanding the world you're about to inherit. The link to the book is in the description below. Also, if you found this journey valuable, please do me a small favor and hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It tells me that these deep dives into the great books are worth it, and it ensures you won't miss our next exploration. Let's keep learning and growing together.